Sophie had always thought her life was calm, predictable, and safe, the kind of life that made people smile when they said, "You're so lucky," yet beneath that surface, a quiet unease had begun to grow, subtle at first, like the faint tremor of a leaf in a gentle breeze, something she tried to ignore because she had so many other things to focus on: no work, friends, family, and the small routines that made life feel orderly. But the longer she lived with Daniel, the more she noticed tiny cracks forming in their shared world, moments that didn't add up, glances that seemed to carry a weight she couldn't name, laughter that sounded distant rather than warm, and little silences at dinner when he would stare off into the distance, lost in thought, as though something else was pulling at him, something he wasn't ready to share. And Sophie, in the beginning, tried to convince herself that it was just stress, that work must be wearing him down, that everyone has moments when their minds drift, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at her like a small, sharp stone in her shoe. And that afternoon, as the golden sunlight poured into their kitchen, she was folding laundry, the soft hum of the washing machine filling the room, when she felt a small slip of paper brush against her hand, almost as if it had deliberately found her, and she looked down to see an envelope that had clearly fallen from the pocket of Daniel's jacket hanging on the chair, a simple, unassuming envelope, cream-colored, with elegant handwriting on it that immediately drew her attention, and her heart began to race with curiosity, fear, and something she couldn't yet name as she picked it up, holding it delicately because it felt heavier than paper should, like it carried a secret inside. And when she opened it, the world seemed to pause for a moment, as if the air itself was waiting for her to take the next breath, and inside was a letter, short but filled with words that made her chest tighten, words of longing, tenderness, and intimacy addressed to someone named Claire, a name Sophie had never heard before, and she froze, unable to move, her mind spinning in a cyclone of questions that demanded answers she wasn't ready for, each word on the page seeming to cut deeper into her heart, not with cruelty, but with the gentle shock of discovery, a revelation that shook the foundation of everything she thought she knew. And she pressed the letter against her chest as if feeling its weight physically might help her make sense of it, but it only made the ache inside her grow, an ache of betrayal, confusion, and fear all mingled together. And for the first time in years, Sophie felt the fragile certainty of her life crumble beneath her fingers, leaving her suspended in a liminal space between disbelief and dawning realization. And yet, even with the fear and the hurt swirling inside her like a storm, there was a small, stubborn part of her that wanted to understand, to uncover the full truth, even if it meant facing pain. And she told herself to wait, to breathe, to not confront Daniel immediately, because she wasn't sure she could handle the answers without first bracing her heart. And so she folded the letter carefully and placed it on the counter, the envelope slightly curling at the edges as though echoing the tension that had begun to fill the room. And she went about her day pretending everything was normal. But each time Daniel walked past, each time he laughed or asked a question, her mind raced, trying to reconcile the warm, familiar man she loved with the hidden part of his life she had just discovered. And that night, as she lay in bed, the letter hidden beneath her pillow, she listened to the quiet rhythm of his breathing in the next room, the soft, steady sound that had always been a comfort now seeming distant, almost foreign. And Sophie felt a knot in her stomach that refused to loosen, a weight pressing on her chest that made sleep impossible. And she found herself replaying every interaction, every glance, every late return home or quick phone call, searching for signs she had ignored, small cracks that now seemed glaringly obvious. And the more she thought, the more the uncertainty grew, until it became an almost physical presence, a shadow lingering over her heart, whispering that nothing was truly as it seemed, that Daniel had been hiding something from her all along, that the life they had built together, full of laughter and warmth and shared memories, might have been built on incomplete truths. And she wondered how long this secret had existed, how many small choices had led him to carry this hidden relationship in silence, and whether he had ever questioned it himself, whether he had struggled with guilt or fear of hurting her. And the thought made her ache in a way she had never felt before, a bittersweet combination of love, heartbreak, and an aching need to understand, to reconcile the man she knew with the man who had written those words for Claire. And Sophie realized that life had a way of surprising people when they least expected it, that even the most ordinary, comfortable lives could contain mysteries, secrets, and emotions that could shake them to their core. And as the night deepened and the house settled into quiet, she felt a mix of fear, anticipation, and a strange, reluctant hope, because now she was awake to a reality she hadn't known before, a reality where love, trust, and honesty would be tested, and Sophie, holding her pillow close and staring at the ceiling, made a silent vow to herself that she would find out the truth, gently, carefully, and bravely, that she would navigate the storm that had suddenly appeared in the calm of her life, and that even if the answers were painful, she would face them, because love, after all, was worth the courage it demanded. And as she finally closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking her, her last thoughts were not of anger or despair, but of the fragile hope that even in secrets and heartbreak, life had a way of revealing clarity, and maybe, just maybe, understanding could heal the fractures she had just discovered. And with that, Sophie drifted into an uneasy sleep, the letter still hidden beneath her pillow, its presence a quiet reminder that tomorrow would bring answers, decisions, and emotions she could no longer avoid. Days after Sophie found the letter, life seemed to continue its usual rhythm, yet beneath the surface, everything had shifted, a quiet tension threading itself through the hours and moments of her days as she moved through the house with a careful awareness, noticing details she had never paid attention to before, like the way Daniel's laughter sometimes sounded forced or how his phone buzzed more often than seemed necessary, and each little thing, previously unnoticed, now carried a weight she couldn't ignore, gnawing at her curiosity and her fear at the same time, making her question everything she thought she knew about the man she loved, about the life they had shared, and about the future she had imagined with him. And she found herself replaying their past conversations, trying to remember if there had been hints, little slips of the tongue or fleeting expressions that might have betrayed a secret he had been keeping. And her mind raced, imagining endless possibilities, each one more painful than the last. And yet, amidst the storm of doubt and suspicion, there remained a stubborn, tender part of her heart that still clung to the Daniel she knew, the man whose eyes had once held a warmth that made her feel safe, whose touch had been gentle, reassuring, whose laughter had filled rooms with joy. And she couldn't quite reconcile the loving husband with the figure suggested in the letter, someone who shared affection and attention with another, someone whose life seemed to exist alongside hers in ways she hadn't imagined. And this contradiction unsettled her profoundly, stirring both fear and a strange, reluctant fascination, as though uncovering the full truth was a puzzle she was compelled to solve even if it meant her heart might break further. And Sophie noticed how the small routines of their life, breakfasts together, the way Daniel brewed coffee just the way she liked it, his habit of leaving notes in her bag or sending messages during the day, suddenly felt layered with unspoken meaning. Each act no longer purely innocent but possibly part of a life she didn't yet understand, and she began to watch him closely, trying to see through the familiar mask of her husband, searching for glimpses of the man she feared he might truly be. And she found herself sitting in the living room one evening, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the floor, staring at him as he read a book in his favorite armchair, noticing how his fingers lingered on the pages, how his brow furrowed slightly in concentration, and for a moment, she caught herself wishing she could just reach across and pull him close, as if physical proximity might erase the growing chasm between them. But the memory of the letter and the name Claire refused to leave her mind, whispering that love alone couldn't answer the questions gnawing at her. And Sophie found herself turning to her closest friend, Emily, in search of support, needing someone to share the confusion that had begun to dominate her thoughts, someone who could offer clarity or at least a listening ear. And when she finally confided in Emily, speaking softly as though the walls themselves might betray her secret, she felt a mixture of relief and vulnerability. The act of speaking aloud validating her fears while also exposing the tender wound that had been forming in her heart. And Emily, in her gentle way, noticed the subtle changes in Sophie, the way her eyes seemed distant, the slight slump of her shoulders, the hesitant pauses in conversation, and said quietly, "Something's wrong. I can see it. You're carrying something heavy." And Sophie, grateful for the recognition yet still afraid of the full truth, nodded and forced a small smile, hiding the letter beneath her bag, trying to convince herself that sharing the burden with Emily might make it easier to bear. But inside, she felt the weight of anticipation growing, a storm building, because now she knew that the secret wasn't just a fleeting worry, it was something real, tangible, and dangerously close. And as the days turned into Evenings, Sophie noticed Daniel's behavior shifting subtly yet unmistakably. He lingered longer on phone calls, returned home with a distracted air, sometimes flinched when she touched his shoulder, and these small gestures, once innocuous, now spoke volumes to her, each one a fragment of a story she didn't fully understand, and Sophie's mind became a constant whirl of questions. Who was Claire? How long had this been going on? Was Daniel truly in love with her, or had he been carrying two hearts in parallel, one hidden, one in plain sight? The curiosity was unbearable, yet she feared confronting him directly, fearing anger, denial, or heartbreak, and so she waited, pacing her days with a careful balance of observation and pretense, and during this time, she noticed that Daniel's eyes, usually so open and expressive, now sometimes held a secret shadow, a subtle flicker of guilt or perhaps longing, and every time their gazes met, Sophie felt a tightening in her chest, a mix of longing for the husband she knew and fear of the truth she suspected, and she began to notice her own emotions shifting as well, an ache in her heart that was part sorrow, part desire, a complicated blend that made her feel alive and vulnerable all at once, and as she observed him one evening, sitting across from her at the dinner table, laughing quietly at something on his phone, she caught herself imagining the life he might be living outside of her knowledge, a life full of moments she wasn't part of, conversations she hadn't witnessed, laughter and tenderness shared with someone else, and the thought both pained and fascinated her, stirring a strange cocktail of jealousy, sadness, and an odd admiration for the complexity of human emotion and connection, and Sophie realized that love was not as simple as she had believed, that even the most devoted partners could harbor secrets born of kindness, fear, or obligation, and she understood that whatever Daniel was hiding, it was complicated, entangled in emotions and circumstances that she could barely comprehend, and this awareness didn't lessen her pain but deepened it, making her heart ache with a bittersweet intensity that was almost physical, a heaviness she carried with her everywhere, and as night fell and the house grew quiet, Sophie found herself standing by the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, feeling small and fragile yet strangely resolute, because she knew that the next steps would require courage, patience, and a willingness to face a reality she hadn't imagined, and as she stared at the world beyond the glass, she whispered to herself, a mixture of determination and fear, I need to know. I need to understand, and with that, she felt the quiet tension of the coming days settle over her, a delicate balance of hope and dread, because the storm had begun, the shadows in her marriage had deepened, and the moment of revelation was drawing ever closer, a truth that would soon demand attention, honesty, and perhaps, the kind of heartache and healing that only life's most profound surprises could bring, and with that thought, Sophie returned to her room, placing her hands gently over the hidden letter once more, feeling its presence like a heartbeat in her own, a silent, constant reminder that nothing would ever be the same again, and yet, in the midst of all the confusion, fear, and longing, a tiny ember of hope remained, fragile but undeniable, that love, even when tested by secrets and silence, could endure, adapt, and perhaps, in its own quiet way, grow stronger than before, and as she finally lay down to sleep, exhausted by the weight of her thoughts and emotions, she closed her eyes, the letter beneath her pillow, the unanswered questions spinning through her mind like stars across the night sky, and she knew that tomorrow, when Daniel returned home, everything could change, and she would have to face the truth. No matter how painful or surprising it might be, the weekend arrived, and Sophie decided to stay home while Daniel went on what he called a business meeting, a small pretense that had suddenly become a door to her curiosity, a chance to uncover the truth she had been circling in her mind like a hawk over fragile prey, and as soon as he left, Sophie felt a strange mixture of excitement, fear, and determination, a pulse racing in her chest that urged her forward despite the gnawing anxiety, and she moved through the house quietly, careful not to make a sound, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor as if the slightest noise might alert some invisible presence that she was about to intrude on his private world, and then she found herself in his study, a room that had always been a place of comfort, where books lined the shelves and the scent of his favorite cologne lingered faintly in the air, a room filled with memories of shared moments when he had explained something patiently, or laughed at one of her jokes, or had offered a reassuring smile during difficult times, yet now the room seemed charged, heavy with anticipation and secrecy, and Sophie's gaze fell on his desk, orderly as ever, yet with one detail that suddenly caught her attention: a small, locked drawer tucked neatly into the side, the kind of drawer that looked ordinary to anyone else, yet now felt like the key to everything, a portal to answers she had been craving, and her hands trembled as she searched for the key, moving through drawers, books, and old photographs, until finally, tucked behind a framed photo of their wedding day, she found it, a small, unassuming key that seemed almost to hum in her hand, and Sophie's breath caught as she approached the drawer again, inserted the key, and turned it with a careful twist, holding her heartbeat in suspense, the tiny click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room, and as she lifted the drawer, she discovered what lay inside: a photo album, thick with pages, filled with images of Daniel with another woman, each picture capturing smiles, gestures, and moments of intimacy that had been hidden from her, and her chest tightened, a sharp, piercing ache spreading through her body as she flipped through the pages, each image a testament to a life she hadn't known, a secret woven carefully behind the scenes of the life they shared, and Sophie felt tears welling in her eyes, blurring the edges of the photographs, a mixture of heartbreak, disbelief, and fascination swelling inside her like a tide she could not hold back, and yet, as she turned the pages, she noticed something else: letters tucked carefully between the photographs, hundreds of pages filled with words that spoke of care, concern, affection, and devotion, words that revealed not just a hidden romance but a story of someone Daniel had quietly supported, a woman named Claire who had relied on him in ways Sophie could barely comprehend, a secret he had carried to protect, perhaps, and to preserve stability in their own lives, and as Sophie read, the sharpness of betrayal softened slightly with understanding, because it became clear that Daniel's actions, though hidden, were not born of cruelty or malice, but of a complicated, quiet sense of responsibility, a desire to help someone in need while navigating his own commitments, and this realization made Sophie's heart ache in new ways, each emotion layered and complex, a tangled web of sorrow, empathy, and lingering love that left her breathless and unsure of how to proceed, and yet, amidst the tears and confusion, she felt a flicker of courage, a stubborn spark that urged her to know more, to see beyond the surface and understand the reasons, the emotions, the choices that had brought them to this point, and she continued through the album, tracing the smiles, the gentle touches, the shared laughter, and the quiet moments captured in the photographs, noticing details that spoke of familiarity, tenderness, and genuine connection, and in doing so, she realized that human relationships are rarely simple, that love can coexist with secrecy, and that the heart often navigates paths that the mind can barely comprehend, and Sophie, sitting there on the study floor, surrounded by the tangible proof of a hidden chapter of her husband's life, felt a whirlwind of feelings: anger, heartbreak, jealousy, curiosity, but also, oddly, a deep empathy for the man she loved, whose choices had been guided by more than desire alone, but by care, caution, and perhaps fear of losing both the woman he had promised his life to and the person he had quietly vowed to support, and she thought of the evenings spent together, the small routines, the laughter, the quiet understanding between them, and wondered how much of it had been real, how much had been shared in genuine love, and how much had been shielded by the weight of unspoken truths, and with each page, each letter, each photograph, she felt the fragile balance of her emotions tip, threatening to collapse under the complexity of revelation, and yet, even in the midst of this storm of feelings, Sophie recognized that this was also an opportunity to confront, to understand, to rebuild, or at least to face reality with eyes wide open, a chance to see Daniel fully, not just the man she had married, but the man he was in all dimensions. Flawed, human, caring, and capable of both secrecy and devotion, and as the afternoon light faded into evening, the shadows in the room deepening around her, Sophie felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief, because now, at last, the secret was no longer hidden, and knowledge, however painful, brought clarity, and clarity brought power, a strange sense of control over the chaos that had been swirling in her mind for weeks, and as she carefully returned the letters to their places in the album, smoothing the pages gently, she understood that this discovery was not an end, but a beginning. The threshold of a journey that would demand honesty, courage, and the willingness to navigate emotions too complex to name simply, and when Daniel returned that evening, she was no longer the same woman who had paced the kitchen anxiously in the days prior. The woman who had questioned, worried, and feared, for now, Sophie had seen the hidden truth, and the next steps would be hers to decide how to confront him, how to speak, how to reconcile love with the knowledge of secrecy. And as the sound of his keys jingled outside, and then the familiar footsteps approached the door, Sophie's heart pounded, a mixture of anticipation, dread, and a fragile hope that whatever conversation awaited them could lead not only to answers but to understanding. And she knew in that moment that the course of their marriage would be forever altered, that the veil of normalcy had been lifted, and that the evening ahead would test the strength of their bond, the depth of their trust, and the resilience of their hearts. And yet, even with all the uncertainty, she felt ready, quietly determined to face Daniel, to speak her truth, to hear his, and to navigate together the fragile terrain of love, secrecy, and human complexity. Because the choice to confront reality, to face the hidden layers of emotion, and to meet the unknown with courage, was the only path that could lead to understanding, forgiveness, and perhaps, the kind of love that survives even when tested by the most unexpected revelations. And with that thought, Sophie smoothed the photo album one last time, placed it carefully back in the drawer, locked it with the key, and took a deep breath, readying herself for the evening, for the conversation that would inevitably come, and for the fragile, emotional reckoning that would define the next chapter of their lives together, knowing that what she had discovered was more than a secret. It was a crossroads, a moment where hearts, truth, and love would collide, and where the courage to face reality would determine the path forward, for better or worse. And with that, she sat quietly, listening for Daniel's return, her heart racing, her mind a storm of questions and emotions. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small ember of hope glimmered, that understanding, honesty, and love could survive even this test. And as the first footsteps echoed in the hallway, Sophie's hand rested lightly on the hidden drawer, ready to face whatever truth awaited, because now, there was no turning back, only the choice to confront, to understand, and to continue, together or apart, on the path that had been irrevocably altered by the discovery she had just made. The morning after Sophie had discovered the album and letters, the house felt unusually still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what was about to happen. And Sophie, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, felt a mixture of anxiety, anticipation, and fragile hope, because today, she would have to face Daniel, to speak aloud what she had uncovered, to confront not just the hidden truth but the emotions it had stirred. And as she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching, familiar yet now carrying a weight she could sense even before seeing him, her heart pounded, a rapid, uneven rhythm that echoed the storm inside her. And when Daniel entered the kitchen, his usual warmth seemed tinged with uncertainty, a subtle shift in his posture, the way his eyes met hers and then quickly darted away, betraying a tension that mirrored her own. And Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself, reminding herself that she had discovered the secret not to punish or blame but to understand, to navigate the complexity of the emotions that had suddenly infiltrated their lives. And she said quietly, "Daniel, I know," her voice soft but firm, carrying the weight of all the days she had spent thinking, worrying, and wondering. And at that moment, she saw the shift in his expression, the mixture of fear, guilt, and relief, a human cocktail that told her that the truth had been waiting for this exact confrontation. And he moved closer, sitting across from her, his hands reaching for hers in a tentative gesture, fingers brushing lightly, seeking connection, reassurance, and perhaps forgiveness before words could fully articulate the emotions in the room. And as he began to speak, his voice low and measured, explaining the past, the circumstances, the reasons for secrecy, the quiet support he had given Claire, and the difficult choices he had made to balance care for another with loyalty to Sophie, she listened, each word a delicate thread weaving together a tapestry of pain, love, responsibility, and the intricate nuances of human relationships. And Sophie realized that what she had initially felt as betrayal was layered with complexity, that human hearts often carry burdens they cannot openly share, and that love, even when tested by secrecy, could contain acts of kindness, protection, and difficult sacrifices that were not always visible on the surface. And as Daniel spoke, recounting moments of struggle, worry, and guilt, Sophie felt a mixture of heartbreak and empathy, her own emotions shifting like the tide. A deep ache intermingled with understanding, sorrow blending with compassion, and a longing to reconnect with the man she had married, the man she still loved despite the revelations, and she realized that forgiveness, if it were to come, would need patience, honesty, and a willingness to embrace both the pain and the humanity behind the secret. And as the conversation continued, they revisited memories together, each small anecdote, each shared smile, each tender moment suddenly reframed in light of what Sophie had discovered, yet still carrying the authenticity of the life they had built. And she began to understand that love was not only the joyous, easy moments, but also the difficult ones, the tests that required courage, empathy, and the ability to see beyond oneself to the heart of another. And as the morning light streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow across the kitchen, Sophie felt the tension between them slowly begin to ease, replaced by a cautious, tentative connection, as if the act of facing the truth had released a breath long held. And she recognized that this moment was not about erasing the pain or pretending the past had not existed, but about acknowledging it, accepting it, and moving forward with eyes open, hearts honest, and a willingness to rebuild trust, piece by piece, day by day. And Daniel, sensing the shift, reached out again, his fingers lightly tracing hers, a silent plea for patience, understanding, and the chance to continue. And Sophie, meeting his gaze, felt the layers of hurt begin to soften, the ache of betrayal giving way to a fragile hope that their love could endure, adapt, and evolve. And in that quiet, emotionally charged space, they began to speak not just of the past, but of the future, tentatively imagining a life where honesty, empathy, and love would guide their steps, a life where secrets would no longer linger in shadows, where communication could bridge the gaps that fear and caution had created. And Sophie realized that even though the path ahead would not be easy, it was theirs to navigate together, with courage, compassion, and the quiet determination to honor both their hearts and the complexities of human connection. And as the hours passed, the kitchen became a sanctuary of conversation, confession, and tentative reconciliation, the air lighter with each shared word, each admission, each expression of understanding. And Sophie felt the deep, slow healing begin, a healing that would take time but was already seeded by their willingness to confront reality and embrace each other fully, imperfectly, and authentically. And as the evening approached, she noticed the small, intimate gestures of love re-emerging, the brush of a hand, the warmth of a smile, the soft, lingering gaze that said more than words ever could. And in those moments, Sophie realized that the discovery of Daniel's secret, though initially devastating, had become a turning point, a catalyst for deeper connection, emotional honesty, and the kind of love that survives trials, heartbreak, and complexity. And she understood that relationships are not only about blissful certainty but also about navigating storms, embracing vulnerability, and choosing to see the human behind every action, the heart behind every choice, and the courage it takes to love fully even when faced with disappointment or fear. And as night fell and the house settled into quiet once more, Sophie and Daniel sat together, hands intertwined, hearts raw but hopeful, and she felt a sense of peace not from forgetting or pretending, but from acknowledging the truth, facing it, and choosing love and understanding despite the pain. And in that moment, Sophie realized that life had a way of testing hearts, revealing secrets, and offering opportunities for growth, and that even in the shadow of heartbreak, love could be rediscovered, rebuilt, and strengthened. And as she rested her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she whispered softly, more to herself than to him, "We will find our way." And in the quiet intimacy of shared understanding, the fragile hope of renewal glimmered, a promise that even after secrets, challenges, and revelations, hearts could heal, love could endure, and the journey forward, though uncertain, could be embraced with courage, honesty, and the quiet, enduring power of human connection. And Sophie knew that this chapter, difficult and emotional as it had been, marked not an ending, but a beginning of a deeper, more honest, and more resilient love, one built not just on joy and comfort, but on truth, empathy, and the courage to face whatever life would bring together. And with that, she closed her eyes briefly, feeling the warmth of Daniel beside her, the weight of the past lifting slowly, and the quiet promise of the future unfolding, a future where love had been tested and survived, and where hearts, having weathered the storm, could now beat in renewed harmony, ready to write the next chapter with honesty, compassion, and hope.